Those themes are some things you're going to hear about as we talk about this idea of reinventing organizations and Teal organizations, because that's at the heart of it. It's this sense of trust between people, and that if you trust people together, they can do great things. So I'm going to let a couple of my colleagues here, Ed and Jay, speak a little bit more about the topic and introduce the topic a little bit more formally. But great job, everybody. You survived, you made it back. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to sit now. Okay, so we talked about car and driver, right? And I think it's an apt metaphor, as Marcus was talking about, for how we choose to kind of like work together and coordinate in groups, right? And when we're navigating the real world, sort of like as we were in car and driver, sometimes we encounter things if we're in cars like intersections, right? And typically when we encounter an intersection, there's kind of like two different types of ways that one might encounter that, right? You might encounter it sort of like on the left-hand side, over there, and you see a stoplight. Or you might encounter something that's over here on the right-hand side, and it's more like a turnabout, or a traffic circle, or a rotary, or whatever. And so I think this is really interesting because what it shows us is that there are two very different ways of interacting a kind of designed environment and figuring out what to do from them. And what's probably most interesting about this is that underneath the designs of these kind of two different approaches to how we coordinate in like a city, like at an intersection, are really two different ways of kind of like thinking what people are likely to do when they try to coordinate. And therefore, like, how should we design it, right? On the left-hand side with the intersection, you basically think, you know what, like, people are probably going to mess it up, right? They're probably going to run into each other. And so we should set up some rules, design some technology, sort of like manage it from town center to make sure that it all works out okay. Basically, we kind of think that, you know, like, there's not a lot of trust that people will figure it out. On the right-hand side, you've got a whole different design for how people might interact with an intersection. And if you dig into it, like, there are also underlying assumptions or beliefs about how people are likely to show up in that situation. For instance, it's basically like, you know what, they're probably going to figure it out, sort of like you guys did in Car and Driver. The assumption that a handful of little social interaction cues are probably going to be enough. And that the simplest rules are going to be the ones that are most effective. And here's what's quite interesting, right? When this shows up in the real world, does this one? Oh, there we go. There we go. When this thing shows up in the real world, the results are quite astonishing. The simpler design on the right-hand side is safer. The simpler design on the right-hand side is more efficient. And the simpler design on the right-hand side is vastly less expensive to run and organize. And I think that that's quite fascinating because the metaphor is quite similar to the way we might think about a large organization of people, right? And if you look at this design, this kind of like tops-down design, what types of assumptions about the people or the way people coordinate inside of a larger group are probably showing up here, right? Simple ones. Like there's this one, like there's like the head and the hands, which is basically an assumption that intelligence is kind of rare. And so the smartest people get up top, right? And it's probably best for the people up top to make the decisions and tell the hands what to do. Same thing for a belief sort of about how do you get the best, highest performance out of people. This belief that like specialization is how you get the best performance out of people. So that's the way we're gonna go. So we put people into these little stovetypes, specialized stovetypes or functions. And same thing, another underlying belief of how do you get to scale, right? And there's this belief that like, you know what, if we add in control and we drive to efficiency, that's the best way for groups of people to work together to scale. And so our group of folks here, the people that Julia introduced sort of as the Teal team, we all kind of stumbled into this observation that we kind of wanted to work in different kinds of organizations, and we're all stumbling into that in various different ways. But it was a hunch that each of us had, observation, something we wanted. And then we all stumbled on this book called Reinventing Organizations. It's written by this guy, Frederick Laloux. And basically what Laloux went out and did a whole bunch of research on, lived at the intersection of all sorts of scientific and theory, right? Like cognitive psychology, childhood and adult development, moral development, worldviews and things of that nature. And what him and a bunch of other common thinkers basically found was that each of those fields actually has a very common framework for seeing how societies develop and grow. And it's that we become more complex over time. Just as how children have very kind of simple frames and beliefs about the world and adults have more complex ones, so too with humanity. And his key observation was basically that as people grew, as we developed as a species over time, every time we hit a new way of seeing the world, a new way of seeing how people thought and how the world should work, we actually came up with new and more powerful types of organizations. So his contribution to this field was one about organizational design. And it was basically that collaboration breakthroughs showed up as the world changed. And so he went and kind of tracked this, and he basically showed that over time, various different types of organizational designs sort of showed up. We moved from kind of power-centric organizational designs, sort of like your tribes, like get small groups of people to work together through power, through hierarchical designs, which sort of brought with them like scalability through control, to meritocratic designs, which brought these great new innovations in terms of like strategy and incentives, very, very much kind of connected with the shift from like an agricultural revolution to an industrial revolution, industrial complex. And then another evolution kind of even beyond that, in that like, hey, there's another way that we can kind of work together to coordinate new types of organizations, ones that are more collaborative, and greater focus on empowerment and consensus. And so his contribution was basically that it was time for another type of organizational design. He called this an evolutionary design, and then he used a whole bunch of color kind of code names to describe all of this, and he called those Teal organizations, or evolutionary organizations. So that's what we're talking about tonight. And basically what he observed, right, was that there's so much going on in the world that it is time right now for a new way of thinking about how we come together, how we organize, how we collaborate, how we coordinate. And I can't talk about all these, but I'll talk about a couple. And I think that the most important thing is that like most of these trends basically orient them towards an observation that there's just a massive amount of change going on in the world. On the left-hand side, it says it's a VUCA world, right? And that's what we as leaders are facing all the time these days, right? It's volatile, it is uncertain what's going on, it's complex, and it is ambiguous. And my company, I work at this company, Jump Associates, our entire positioning is helping large organizations deal with this issue. How do you grow in times of rapid change? Same thing too with the one that's to the right of that, where it says, internet is the air we breathe. And it's quite, like, we often think, hey, we get all these great new tools from the internet and all that kind of stuff, we can connect and all that. But for me, what's most interesting is that it is also the gift of a completely new metaphor for how the world works. It's a much more decentralized and network-based metaphor. And all of a sudden, we all understand like systems thinking and systems design in a much more natural way than we ever did before. And that kind of like decentralized approach to coordination and collaboration, honestly, we couldn't wrap our heads around it a couple decades ago, and we kind of understand it now because the internet is in the air we breathe. And just one more on the kind of like lower left-hand side there, it says, everything bad is now good. A great book written by Stephen Johnson called Everything Bad Is Not Good For You. And he told this fascinating anecdote that, like, if you go back to the 70s, you think about like Starsky and Hutch and stuff like that. The popular culture of the day is so different than what the popular culture, what the masses of what everybody watches today. Right? The Sopranos and Game of Thrones and all the stuff that we watch right now have like 2 to 3 times more complex storylines, moral complexity that like we never would have been willing to wrestle with in the past, and yet we deal with it. And it's not just that the intellectuals deal with it, we all deal with it at like a popular level. Right? So there's just a lot of stuff going on that allows an evolutionary organization to exist today. And same thing too, that like we actually have enabling capabilities that we didn't even have when Lulu wrote that book, right? We have platforms that help us coordinate and collaborate in new kinds of ways. We have networks and marketplaces that allow talent to come together and break apart, just like what you guys are driving forward, Tyler, with Lingo Live. Increased mobility, both in terms of like what we can do and where we can work, but also in terms of like the people that we go and see. Like we cross borders, we're much more traveled population. And we have all sorts of tools that allow us to sense and respond to what's happening in the world, and continuously deliver and drive out like new experiences and designs into what our customers get. So that's why now. And I think what we should do is I should have Ed basically tell you a little bit more about what these evolutionary organizations look like. How do they work? What are the breakthroughs?
Thank you, Jay. I'm going to get the counterintuitive clicker. Down means forward, which is actually Teal-y in the sense that you're growing roots, not just growing up. So thanks for the why and the why now of Teal organizations. I'm Ed Fraunheim. I am a writer, work at Great Place to Work. We'll talk more about us in a little bit, but just a little brief intro. And I'm excited to share these sort of three breakthroughs that Laloux talks about in terms of evolutionary Teal organizations, kind of the what and the how. And the first one that he identifies, these are breakthroughs from earlier generations of organizations. Self-management is this idea that people at all levels of the organization have decision-making power. And it gets back to that trust idea that you experienced in the car and driver idea, that we can actually trust teams and individuals to really make decisions for their areas of responsibility. The second one is evolutionary purpose. And what we're talking about here is this kind of difficult concept to grasp, that organizations have life and a sense of direction on their own. And then it changes based on the perceptions and the sensing of the people within them to figure out where do we need to go now as an organization. And the third one is wholeness. This idea that we need to be able to bring our entire selves to work. Not just our competence and our strength, but our doubts, our intuition, even our spirituality. And also we need to break down this barrier between our human beings and nature, so that organizations and individuals are mindful of that connection we have to the planet at all times as well. So we're going to talk throughout the night about some of the details of these different breakthroughs. But just to give you a quick snapshot of the current paradigm in terms of where we're going. Julia has been doing great slide work on us here. So in the current paradigm, our companies are generally profit and revenue driven, right? Growth in the sense of going up and out, more and more. Purpose driven is the way that evolving organizations are going. They don't worry about the money as much as they worry about the purpose. Strategic planning is something we do in our organizations now. Instead, we're moving towards sensing and responding in a fluid, continual way, so you're constantly adapting to what's going on around you, all the complexity that Jay was talking about. Chain of command and empowerment. This is that top-down model of the word chart Jay showed, and I put empowerment in quotes because I think in a lot of ways it's fake power. Teams and individuals are empowered, but they actually can't make a decision without it being approved by someone higher up in the chain. We're moving to a place where there's emergent leadership, which is to say anybody can maybe step up and lead a project or a day or a year of something. And power is distributed, real power, the ability to make a final judgment, a final call on a topic. And the last conversation we'll mention is the work-life balance that we're all struggling with. We're moving to a time when work and the rest of life are integrated as a whole. You're one person, whether you're at work or you're home, you are unified, you're integrated. So if we step back a little bit and look at the kind of 30,000 viewpoint, we wanted to point out a couple of related developments. This is kind of similar to the slide Jay showed, but some signposts that the Teal movement is emerging. One of them is holacracy. How many people have heard of holacracy? A lot of people by now, yeah, a lot of you guys. And this concept that we're going to have self-managed teams with a lot less hierarchy. Zappos might be the most famous company that's adopted this. The agile software movement. Coders are now making products and making software with much less of that hierarchical waterfall approach, but rather they have the power to iterate and work with customers directly to turn out new products. Microsoft is among many software companies using the agile method. Servant leadership is a philosophy of leadership that's been around for a couple decades now, but it's gaining more and more traction. It turns the hierarchy on its head. The leader is supposed to support those on the front line. They don't make all the judgment calls. They're there as a servant to those that are lower down in the organizational chart. Wegmans, anyone hear of Wegmans here? A lot of you guys know Wegmans. It's a fantastic grocery chain on the East Coast that I love. They do great stuff. And then conscious capitalism, this movement that Whole Foods co-founder John Mackey has been central to. Business is not just about making money. It's about serving people and serving the planet. And then the last thing I don't have a book for, but what I'm talking about here is the growing interest in yoga, in meditation, in mindfulness, in our personal lives, but also in our organizations, like Salesforce. Right down the street here, Salesforce has devoted a meditation room on every other floor of their building. And it might be more on their newest tower, I'm not exactly sure, but gets at the kind of way we're trying to step back from that go, 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 just achieve philosophy. And that is kind of one of the last couple things we wanted to share at this high level about what the Teal movement is about. There's a new mindset underway. In the current situation, we tend to have a mindset, a set of beliefs, deep assumptions, kind of like Jay was talking about the traffic circle, of scarcity of intelligence, for example. There's constant competition to rise, to get up to the top of the rat race. It's very ego-driven. And our self-worth is from our achievement in large part. Can we get to that promotion? That's what makes us feel good. And the fundamental mindset is about fear. We're in trouble. We gotta get past the danger. In the evolving organization, we have a mindset about bodies. Collaboration is much more preferred. The ego is tamed. And our self-worth comes from a deeper place. For a lot of people, it's a spiritual place, like there's the spark of divinity in all of us. And the fundamental concept here is one of trust. You're trusting that life is evolving in a positive way. The last thing we want to cover in this initial kind of overview of Teal is a new metaphor. For more than 100 years, the dominant metaphor about organizations has been the machine. And we are cogs. People are fit into the machine as a cog. And that efficiency and productivity are the king. There's no life in this system. We're moving to the organization as organic, living organism, like a coral reef, where every person in the organization is acknowledged as alive. The organization overall is living, and it supports life beyond it, just like the coral reef supports flourishing fish. So this is the metaphor, this life-giving metaphor is the one that I'm drawn to, that our Teal team is drawn to, and that growing numbers of people around the world are drawn to. How about you?